Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Decision Hour. I'm your host, Adam Bird, and I got a great interview lined up for you today. He's a near and dear friend of mine. I'm honored to call him a friend. He's a retired Army officer. He's an author, a speaker. Fun fact, he's no stranger to the show, but a quick little fun fact about him is if you are a Iraq veteran, 2003 era, if you remember being downrange, we had those cards, the 55 most wanted cards. This is the man. He's the legend behind that. So my good friend, Dr. Hans Mumm. Hans, how are you?
I'm loving life. How about you, Adam?
I'm doing great. Listen, I appreciate your time. I always have just a wonderful time talking to you and a ton of respect for you, and I appreciate your friendship. I want to dive in today. First off, let's mention this. You're an author, and you've written half a dozen books or so. Yes. And the first time we had you on the show was probably around the 2015. You had just written the first book, but since then you've written several others. Let's talk about those real quick.
So absolutely, I'll throw those up real quick. So the first book was coming out of Applying Complexity Leadership with Drone Aerospace Integration. That was the first one. And then quickly after that, I ended up doing a co-authored book on lightning growth, looking at success for leaderships today. And in this one, I really looked at what is it going to take for leaders to really embrace, understand, and move technology in the way that we need to. Because our old leadership style is not working, and it continues not to be working. And then the third book that I did was Unmanned Aircraft Systems in the Cyber Domain, Protecting U.S. Air Assets. And then we quickly followed that one up with the second version of that book. This one's about 715 pages. This was a request because these books are being used by Kansas State University, Embry-Riddle, a few other people to actually teach this material. And then the next book that ended up was Counter UAV, and this one was put out earlier this year, basically late last year, early this year. We haven't gone out to press too much with this one, only because of COVID. Because as soon as we start putting these out, we get requests to teach the material, help the material, bring the books. And with COVID, it really kind of hurts us on that one. And then in between, because we just didn't want to stop quite yet, our next book, which comes out in about 8 to 12 weeks, is another co-authored book, and that is on unmanned vehicle systems operations on air, land, and sea. And that's looking at the integration as all of these different autonomous systems start to integrate.
There's so many questions. Why is it so important, Hans, for these unmanned aircraft and unmanned vehicles that we're starting to see? Why is that the next phase? Why is it so important?
So autonomous systems, you're going to see not only in the military and the civilian worlds. So you've seen what they can do in the military worlds. Right. What we haven't seen is their true potential in the civilian world.
But haven't we started to see, like, isn't it, what was it, Uber or something like that, or the delivery system? Somebody's using some unmanned vehicles for taxi service or Uber or something like that.
So we are starting to scratch the surface. And when I say we, I mean the industry, not necessarily America. Okay. They are flying in other countries right now. They're not flying necessarily in the U.S. But with the air vehicles themselves, you have everything from passenger vehicles to being able to use them for COVID. Looking at China is actually using them to track some of the COVID issues that they've been having. They've also used them just to be able to have a PA system in the air, because not everybody in China has access to the internet or has a phone, especially in the Wuhan area. And so they've actually put them up and they're using them as the PA system. to make announcements about, wash your hands, COVID issues that are going on, and everything else. They're actually using it as a way to be able to get information out to their citizens, the air vehicles. Now, that has a double-edged sword because they can also kind of spy on their citizens at the same time.
Yeah.
But, we are dealing with a communist country that has the right to do that under their communist laws. So,
do you see something like that transferring into the United States? I mean, you and I have talked on offline about this. We are so far behind in the technology side of things when it comes to this stuff. Just how far behind are we?
So to give you an idea, when you're looking at the air vehicles, yes, we will actually use them, and we have used them in the U.S. when it comes to COVID issues, when it comes to the riots, when it comes to the protest issues. We're using these things already. They're just with the use and permission of the FAA. But when you start to talk about, where are we in the world? Are we number one? No, not even close. The first drone port in the world was Rwanda, Africa, not Dallas, Texas. When you start to look at yes,
Rwanda,
Africa, and it's actually operating extremely well. They have some very interesting aircraft that are flying there, including some aircraft that basically fly without human intervention. So they end up getting their instructions on the packages they deliver. So they're actually delivering things like plasma and other things. Interestingly enough, one of the things that they're finding that they need to be able to deliver is international paperwork. So if you have bills of lading, or if you have international paperwork, a lot of that still actually has to have a physical wet signature on it.
Okay.
Well, if you are going to send a courier from your law office on, some vehicle and try to send them out to the ship in order to move that paperwork, when you're dealing in a country that may not be quite secure, such as Rwanda, Africa, your courier will probably lose his little moped along the way.
Right.
So what they're finding is if they actually use UAVs, then they don't have that problem. It's faster, it's easier, it's more secure. And the way that the UAVs are actually functioning is that they actually have the ability to recharge themselves, do inductive charging. And I'll show you a quick example that they just take a base quad rotor and they can put an inductive charger on the bottom, just the same way as your cell phone has an inductive charger where it just sits on a pad. So they just land, inductively charge, they get their new instructions, and usually there's just some sort of a pod that connects to it. It flies away, it does its business, it comes back, and it recharges and gets ready for its next mission.
All right, so now I got another question with from the drone side of it. This is amazing. So I'm assuming that the drones themselves have to have some type of flight plan then embedded into the system prior to takeoff. Correct.
So they get instructions. They can get instructions basically from the inductive pad as it's being charged. It can get instructions on waypoints or GPS or certain other things. So keep in mind that the GPS system here in our country is not that great at the moment. It's having some challenges. But what you can do is you can change out your GPS chips, which is what I did with mine. And this is an American GPS chip, which basically only looks at the American GPS signals. Well, when I was working on an experiment with my drone, I found that I couldn't do what I wanted to do because I had too much GPS drift. The GPSs weren't really working the way that they should. So what I did was I changed the chip out, and now I get Glasnost, which is the Russian satellites, and then I can also pick up the Chinese satellites. So when you're overseas, you're not really dealing in US GPS. You're dealing in multiple country GPS. So your signals are a lot more precise in a lot of ways. So being able to do exactly what Rwanda is doing is not out of the question when you are tying multiple countries' technologies together.
Is there a fear that using this type of technology, you mentioned earlier that China as an example, they're being successful in their trials and stuff like that, using it for announcements and whatnot, but at the same time, based off of their laws, can spy on their people.
Mm-hmm.
Some would say that as we bring that technology into the United States, is that something, given our government's history and whatnot, is there a potential that could possibly happen? And not to say, most people nowadays, we have these and we've been, if they wanted to listen to you, they could, but it is that something that we're talking about now, bringing into fruition here in the next couple of years here in the U.S.?
So privacy sort of started to die with the satellite, when you had no idea that anybody was watching you anyway.
Right.
So privacy rights have slowly started to die over the years anyway. And I think that they will continue to sort of wither. We will get a little bit of our privacy rights when we're looking at medical or other things. But when you're looking at, purchases online, I mean, all of that information is for sale.
Right.
So I think that trying to fight for privacy, I think what we're trying to do is fight for a wall. Like, where does it stop? But we're not really fighting for privacy rights anymore, because privacy's kind of gone.
That's a good point.
But if you look at the idea of what other systems, what other autonomous systems are out there that are already interacting with us, and if you don't mind, I can actually share a screen.
Yeah.
And one of the things that is out there, which is really interesting, and it says that I can't share yet. One of the things that's out there is a interesting robot called Moxie, and it's basically, they call it a revolution in child development. And when you look at the idea of Moxie, Moxie is a robot that basically teaches your kid. Now, wouldn't that have been really helpful to have before COVID? Yes. However, one of the challenges that Moxie and other people are having is at what point does privacy come into play? So when you look at some of the other technologies that are out there, Russia actually has a humanoid that they sent up into space. So Russia has already sent up a humanoid robot into space. Has America done that?
No.
No. Does America have one? No. But this gives you an idea as to sort of how far behind we are when you look at this. So this was September of 2019. This was last year that they did this. Understanding the safety requirements for space and sending an unmanned rocket up with a robot on it to then work within the International Space Station and then go home was pretty incredible. Amazingly enough, we didn't hear about much of it here in the U.S.
Why is that?
I think we're more interested in Kim Kardashian.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're really interested in Russian robots.
Oh.
But Russia has already looked at, here's their next version. So they're already moving forward. So they already successfully have done it, and now they're planning for the next. So when you look at these different technologies that are out there, you start to look at things like, Uber.
Right.
Okay, Uber starts to talk about, the self-driving vehicle. But why aren't they here? Well, again, had we have moved on these technologies 10, 15, 20 years ago, when many of us in the industry were begging people to move on these things, and they wouldn't move on the technologies. If you had this technology during COVID, think about what would have happened. Commerce wouldn't have stopped the way it did, because when you got into a taxi, it's an unmanned taxi. It brings you where you're going, and when it stops, it simply disinfects itself, right? It has a blue light or a disinfecting mechanism. It disinfects itself and then goes and picks up another passenger. It would have literally changed how COVID was dealt with had we have actually had this type of technology. And you're thinking, well, okay, so what does that mean? Interestingly enough, Mercedes already has
Yeah.
on the open market. You can go and purchase right now
Yeah.
a vehicle in Germany, not here in the US, in Germany, that is already rated to 37 miles an hour on its own. And we are so far behind that Germany already has a Department of Motor Vehicles and a Department of Autonomous Vehicles. We haven't even figured out what to do yet. We have
why is
all
that?
of our independent states.
Are we just being secret about it, or is this something that we're just that it's just not on the radar for us?
Part of the challenge is
or is it money? Or is it people fighting over who's going to come up with it? And I'm not trying to sound political or anything like that, but is it maybe? I mean, I would assume that probably has a tie in it as well.
Part of it is really how our laws are set up. So if you look at Germany, when East-West came back together as unified Germany, they tried to unify their laws. We are independent states.
Right.
So our states can decide whether a vehicle drives on the road, whether it doesn't, what the safety factors are, everything else. One of the big challenges that we have here in the United States is that for some reason we refuse to understand what an autonomous infrastructure is. So when you look at other countries, they're starting to put sensor systems into their stoplights, into their lights, into their signage. So an autonomous vehicle can understand and get a feedback mechanism. So almost all autonomous cars work the same way. They have a radar system and they're out there looking, and they basically are saying, well, I'm doing well. I haven't hit anything yet. Well, other countries are saying, that's not such a good idea. How about this? How about we put a radar reflector that's 50 cents about every 200 feet. So we give a feedback loop to the autonomous vehicle to say exactly where you are and that you're doing well, or do you need to make a correction? Keep in mind that, we have over a million hours in a vehicle, in a manned vehicle. And if that manned vehicle has an accident and it's the vehicle's fault, right, and kills one human being, nobody cares. It's just, okay, it's obviously, it's the way life is. Nothing is perfect. But we had an Uber car end up killing somebody in Arizona who, by the way, stepped out in front of that car. And it didn't matter if it was an automatic car, an autonomous car, or a person in that car. There's no way you would have, the laws of physics said that you couldn't have stopped.
Right. She
stepped out in front of that car. She was killed, and then they halted almost all autonomous car technology. They just said, whoa, this is going too fast. Really? We're going to let the entire world move forward and whoop us based off the idea that one person did something foolish.
So let me ask you this. I go back to the question, why is it so important to have these?
So not only are we looking at commerce and we're looking at technology moving forward, when you start to look at the idea of the U.S. being stuck in the past and the rest of the world moving forward, it not only hurts us in the way of civilian and commerce, it hurts us in technology, and it hurts us when we look at our defense. When you start to look at the idea that countries are moving towards an autonomous system in their civilian world, they could easily renegotiate those things very quickly and make them into military pieces of hardware.
And that's assuming they haven't done so already.
So it's not that difficult. But now, if you look at the U.S. war plans for any country, anywhere, any conflict, it normally looks at the idea of man and machine, a soldier, men, women fighting,
right,
a war. It has not taken into the aspect of the total autonomous. So air, ground, sea, underwater, water, humanoid, cyber, and exoskeleton. It has not taken into account all of these things are starting to talk to each other. They're just not doing it here in the U.S. So when we start to look at how do we fight these things when we can't even figure out how to use them?
You mentioned like they're starting to talk to each other. I think you're going to know where I'm going with this. So who controls that, and who's to say that event, like what happens if the bots or robot, if they don't start responding to commands, and they start is there like an automatic kill switch, for lack of a better phrase?
This is where artificial intelligence and quantum starts to come into play. Is when you're looking at what are you trying to get this thing to do? What's the goal? That's where you have to start to bake in the idea of your security, to make sure that you're the only one controlling it, to make sure that if there is something that goes wrong, that you have the ability to either step in as a human, so optionally piloted vehicles, which is really where we're at right now in the world.
Right.
So even when you look at the Mercedes vehicles, they're sort of optionally piloted. So you can drive them, or you can ask the vehicle to drive them, but you have the ability to take them back over. So you need to have some sort of an intervention ability. So when we look at these things and we look at artificial intelligence, how far do we understand it? Well, right now it's sort of a little more than a buzzword. We have some basic understanding, but there's too many articles out there, trying to get people to believe that, we have the artificial intelligence, we have Skynet. Skynet's coming online. It's going to take over the world. Think about it. think about it. I can't even get people to update their phone software. And back in the day, you couldn't get people to understand how to change the date and time on their VCR.
Right.
So are you really introducing Skynet?
Right.
No. Are you slowly moving in a direction to understand deep analytics on information? Yes, you are. So when you start to look at how does that play out into the autonomous world, now you can start to look at a more efficient and effective manner of working, of moving goods and services. So I'll give you an example. The unmanned underwater vehicles are actually starting to look at putting bases of operation underwater. So they won't be on the surface anymore. You won't have to worry about them. They're not taking up real estate. They're not doing any of that. They will actually base the unmanned underwater vehicles underwater, and you will be able to run logistics underwater from ocean to ocean, right? From sea to shining sea. So you will no longer have them on your roads. So you think, well, that's interesting. Well, take it to the next step. So Toyota, as crazy as this sounds, Toyota has funded an entire city with no actual presence other than humans on the surface. So they are funding an entire city where all logistics, water, electricity, waste, food, everything gets carried underneath the city. Everything goes underground. And the only thing that's on top is the humans living. So, and that's Toyota. I mean, that's a car company.
So there's a lot of tunnel systems.
I'm going to take over real quick one more time.
Yeah.
Because here's the interesting thing with a car company. A car company is moving in a direction that could actually put it out of business. But they're moving in that direction. So here is where, again, Toyota is test flying an unmanned air vehicle, and this will replace your car over time. So there are companies out there in the world that are understanding that the world's moving forward. Commerce is going to move forward. Technology is going to move forward. Infrastructure is going to move forward. So my question is why are we still repaving the exact pavement that was paved in the 1950s the exact same way, with no changes, with no infrastructure updates, and with no understanding of the future?
So let me ask you this. It raises a question with all of this going. I mean, you're talking underwater, bases and stuff like that, that's actually really cool. I think we should be using those to explore the sea, since it's been one thing that we have not done much of anyway. That's probably another show.
Okay, so just read the next book when it comes out. You'll learn. Just throwing a plug in there.
And then you talk about these. It sounds like there's a lot of tunnel systems, which is also another show in itself for a lot of different reasons. But you're talking about, using it for transport and whatnot. I look at that and it's like, okay, are we taking away jobs then from humans because we're going more the autonomous route? And if so, what does that look like and I'm just using the U.S. as an example. We're shorthanded on jobs right now, and you can take it as people are just lazy. I wouldn't argue with you with that. Or they're not qualified for the right particular jobs. I wouldn't argue with that as well. But the jobs that are out there for the average Joe or average Jane that could go out and get a job, if those jobs are taken over by an autonomous system, what does that look like? Are we setting ourselves up for another problem in the future then?
So I think that the question has multiple different answers, but I'll try to answer it this way. First is remember the internet was going to be the destruction of all jobs too.
Right.
That ended up being not only not true, but creating hundreds of millions of jobs around the world.
Right.
So you can look at this and say, do we embrace it and work towards additional industries, or do we look at it and we say, okay, at what point do jobs that can be done by a robot make more sense to be done by them instead of a human, whether it's dull, dirty, dangerous jobs, or does the market force it into place based on economics? I'll give you an example.
Ooh.
If you look at McDonald's or anybody else out there, they took away their counters and now you use a kiosk to make your orders.
Right.
That was an economic decision going more towards the autonomous. So you will go in and order something and it will be made for you. And in some markets, they're test marketing, actually making the burgers, making the entire things with robots without people. So when does the economics come into play? And then the other part is when you're looking at the education, when does the education come into play? At what point does the government say, we're not training the right people for the right thing? Where do they step in, and does that start to take away your privacy and your individual freedom to make a decision? The other thing we have to start looking at, whether people like it or not, is does the autonomous world create the need for a universal income? Does it create that need to say that robots are now doing a majority of the jobs, and so humans have more time for luxury and play and whatever else, and discover themselves or whatever they're going to do? And so do we have to look at a universal income? So there's a lot more
that's
a lot more issues than most people understand when it comes to autonomous, and it's one of the reasons why some countries are moving quickly ahead in it, and others, they're trying to figure out. But there's issues when you look at right now in Europe and in Canada. They're looking at the idea: does an autonomous system or an AI system, if it becomes self-aware, does it deserve human rights? We're not even discussing that here in America, but Europe and Canada are. So how is it, again, we're supposed to be so advanced and so technologically moving ahead and with all of these industries and everything else, yet we're not engaged in the leading edge conversations. Somebody else is going to make those decisions. And when they make those decisions, it may not be the best thing for America.
That's scary when you put it that way, Hans.
Well, if right now we have, IBM has Watson. And Watson, as an AI, claims that it is close to being self-aware. We as humans say that we're on the top of the food chain because we claim to be self-aware. Now, are we? You could argue that one way or the other sometimes.
Right.
But we claim to be on the top of the food chain because of that. If an autonomous system actually becomes what it deems as self-aware, how do you then delineate a human from a piece of AI? A human is technically a battery, right? We make electricity. That's how we make our nerves and muscles move, is electricity. AI has electricity. We think, it thinks. We can take in information and make decisions based on it. It can do the same thing.
There's so many things, and I'm going to go kind of conspiracy on this here, but if you're talking about giving rights to a robot, so to speak, right? Who's to say that they, we have humans. We're not perfect. We're sinners. You have humans that are out there that are just horrible people that commit horrible acts of crime and whatnot. If these robots think for themselves, not necessarily what you didn't say is they have emotion, but I mean, if they think of something where like, I'm going to do this, that might be breaking the law as a human, who's to say that they can't start just taking out humans? So
I'll answer.
Where do you draw the line there when you're creating that then?
So first thing is and hopefully your viewers can saw the Moxie. Moxie actually has the ability to project certain emotions already. In China, they are using a very interesting AI system where they're teaching people how to speak English, but they're doing it through computer simulations. And there's cameras within the room. And if somebody looks like they are disinterested, or they don't understand, or they're falling asleep,
I've seen this. I've seen this.
The computer actually can understand the emotion based on certain things and can self-correct or correct that individual, right? Wake them up, try to get them engaged with a game, try to change how they're actually interacting or teaching them. So go to a video instead of having them read something. The computer can actually make that change in China already. So we are working in that direction. I wouldn't say that we're even close when we talk about human emotions, because human emotions are difficult at best. And they're different for literally every synapse, and we take in every all of our different senses can change our emotion and our emotional states and everything else. We haven't gotten close to that yet. Now, when you talk about the idea of whether a robot can commit a crime, so keep in mind that Sophia was the robot that was given rights. And voting rights. It was given citizenship in Saudi Arabia about 3 years ago.
Right. Yep. So
Sophia is still around, and she continues to learn, and they're moving towards sort of Sophia 2.0, where they're going. But Sophia was only given a small amount of information compared to what she could have been programmed with. But when we start to look at laws, we start to have to look at things like ethics. So in one of the second version of the unmanned aircraft, I actually did a chapter on ethics in here, looking at the idea of how do we start to determine ethics when it comes to unmanned systems. So if you look at an Uber car, it's driving down the road, a boy runs out in front chasing his ball, and his dog runs behind him. What should the unmanned Uber car do? Should we tell it that all human life is absolutely must be sanctioned, so it cannot hit the human, no matter what. So it must avoid the human. Does that mean that it then can hit the dog? Well, I don't think PETA is going to go with that.
Right.
So let's try again. And then if it says, all life, regardless whether it's an animal or a human, life must be preserved, and it swerves off and hits a tree. Wait a minute, I said this was an Uber. What if there's a passenger in the back? Why is the passenger's life less than others' lives? So when you start to look at, giving it the ability to understand laws and rules and everything else, now you're into an ethical dilemma, which we are struggling to have people understand ethics. Forget about computer.
It's everything that's going on right now. Hans is absolutely amazing. It's mind blowing, and it's almost scary. Not so much I wouldn't say in a bad way. It's scary that the U.S. is so far behind when it comes to this stuff. And you always look at us as like the powerhouse nation that kind of led in a lot of this. And we don't hear about it. You're not seeing this stuff in news coverages. It's not front page news. There's could be 1,000 different reasons that you and I could go into for that. Well,
Well, the sort of the scarier part is that it is front, and I'm going to jump on shared screen again real quick. It is front page news in the rest of the world.
Right. Well, and that's just it.
So here's, the Mexican cartel is now using explosive packed drones
as a
new brand of warfare.
Yep.
So there are people that are using these things in a nefarious way. And so, and then when you start to look at, wait a minute, the AutoX, this just opened in 2020, just about 6 weeks ago. And what opened the show in Shanghai was actually a robot taxi. And so it is happening around the world. But
we're not seeing it here in the U.S.
We're not hearing a lot of it here in the U.S. And even U.S. companies, they're working a lot more overseas than they are here. You're just starting to hear about Amazon trying to figure out the delivery system here in the U.S. You're starting to hear about these other things. But what we're not hearing is what's the integration. So if you want to take one for one and you want to say, okay, we're just going to deal with the air vehicle right now, you're going
to have to rewrite laws and stuff like that. FAA, how high they can fly. There's a lot of things that go into that.
Well, and you've already lost because the air vehicle is going to talk to ground vehicles. So right now you have Domino's Pizza.
Yeah.
Is already operating a ground vehicle in Florida. It's actually operating quite well in a very small area. They have requested the ability to start flying pizzas. Well, when that occurred, I chatted with some of the folks and I said, okay, but if you have a flying vehicle and a ground vehicle, they're going to talk to each other at some point because somebody's going to forget to put in the soda for the order, and the ground vehicle is going to go and chase the air vehicle with the soda, right? To make sure that the customer gets their full order. So at some point they're going to talk to each other. So I made some calls and I said, well, wait a minute. If the air vehicle talks to the ground vehicle and the ground vehicle talks to the air vehicle, who's in charge? Who is in charge? Well, amazingly enough, when I talked to DOT Ground, they said, well, we're in charge, of course, because we started the experiment with the folks at Domino's. And amazingly enough, when I talked to folks at the FAA, they said, no, we're in charge because we're the flying thing. We are the most dangerous part in this whole thing.
So nobody knows.
And so, when I was in government, I left the government with a couple of different white papers. Attempting to sort of move them in a direction. One of them was you need an office of autonomous systems. You have got to get somebody in control of this. There are too many autonomous systems out there, and the average person can go out and buy them. You and I can go out and buy air vehicles and ground vehicles right now. We can tag them together and we can go do
whatever
fun things, interesting things, or nefarious things.
Right.
And nobody is in charge of any of this. this office says go talk to that office. What law enforcement official has been trained on how to deal with an air vehicle talking to a ground vehicle going and stealing things from a location? None.
Right.
None, not one. So even if you look at the air vehicles, show me a law enforcement official that has been trained with the proper equipment and with the proper laws backing him to be able to deal with an air vehicle that is over somebody's house, taking pictures of their daughter sunbathing, which is why the gentleman in Kentucky shot the aircraft down a couple of years ago. We're just not keeping up very well, and when we don't keep up very well, not only we need the autonomous office, but we need the autonomous infrastructure to be able to start to control and understand what's going on and move forward within the world. If you look on the news, the average person thinks that we're doing great. They think, oh, well, we have smart cities. Stop, time out, wait. No, a smart city talks about the idea that you have internet connection. A smart city talks about the idea that you have IoT, you have Internet of Things, that your refrigerator talks to your doorbell. It does not have the ability to have an autonomous infrastructure. Scary.
It's very. We're up on
when we have what we used to look at as sort of a second and third tier countries that are literally leapfrogging where we are.
Right. And yeah, it's.
And when you start to look at the military equipment, and you start to look at the idea that we spend billions of dollars trying to build military equipment, where they can go and take a couple $100 civilian toy and basically make it do almost the same thing as our $1 billion piece of equipment.
All right. Yeah, no, it's to think that you can take a toy, go to the toy store and buy a drone at I won't say any of the stores, but you buy a drone and then turn it into, like you said, the cartels. And let me back up real quick, folks. You're online listening to this show. Go to hansmumm.com and you can see the articles on his website, and you can also see the books that he has written as well. I've been meaning to say that for the last almost 40 plus minutes when I wanted to make sure we got your website in there, and we'll have this up on our social media links and whatnot. And if you're not looking at AI, if you're not looking at the drones, you read these articles. They're very interesting, and I would encourage you to follow Hans on LinkedIn, as oftentimes he puts his articles up there and his website as well. Hans, we're up on time right now, but I want to have you back on because I know there's a counter side to this that we did not get into that I'm very interested in talking about. So there'll be a round two on this topic. But before we let you go, any closing words?
I think that we live in interesting times. We can't look at things in a negative light. We need to look at them in the positivity for what the technology can do for us. Obviously, technology can be used for good or evil. It's really up to the policymakers and the leaders to steer that in the correct direction.
I love it. hansmumm.com. Make sure you check it out. Before we let you go, big shout out to our parent network, Heroes Media Group. Go over there, check out all the articles and new shows on the network. Simply go to www.heroesmediagroup.com. Until next time, you've been listening to The Decision Hour.